What's going on, guys? Untitled Chapter here with streaming For Dummies. Today we're doing two things. We're going to break down everything that goes inside your computer, make it as easy to understand as possible. When you hear people start saying things like CPU, RAM, GPU, motherboard, all these different words, we're going to take that from being complicated jargon to super easy to understand basics. On top of that, we're going to recommend what you should be using if you're a streamer.
And the cracks begin to show.
What are the parts that go inside of the computer? Well, let's just name them all first, and we'll break them down piece by piece. Motherboard, you got your CPU, you got your GPU, you got your RAM, you have your PSU, power supply unit, you have your SSD or HDD, CPU cooler, you have your case, and you have your OS or operating system, which most people neglect to talk about. Let's break them down. The motherboard. So what the motherboard is, guys, the motherboard essentially houses all the components in the computer, powers all of them. Power from the power supply unit goes only into the motherboard, and the motherboard then sends out the power to the rest of the computer. If you want to think of it in a more simpler sense, imagine the motherboard is the roots of a tree, and it's taking up the nutrients and the water and all the things that the tree needs, and sending it out to the rest of the computer. There are other parts of the tree or the branches that will be your other piece of the computer. CPU, Central Processing Unit. You've heard the term before. You don't know exactly what it's for, but you know it's important. What the CPU does is it looks at every other piece on the motherboard, processes what each piece does, then decides what piece is activated at what time and how much energy is being exerted towards that piece. A really simple way to think of the CPU is it is the brain of the computer, and it will decide what parts of the body to move. So if my CPU is my brain, and say my RAM is my hand or my GPU is my hand, well, when I'm ready for my GPU to be used, or my hand, my CPU tells my hand to move up and down. And then if I need more, then my CPU says, okay, move faster up and down. CPU is the brain, telling the rest of the computer, the rest of the body parts, what to do, when to do it, how fast to do it. CPU cooler, super simple. It's either a fan or some sort of water cooling rig that its specific job is to cool down the CPU. The CPU exerts a lot of heat, especially when you start doing more stuff with it. It's very important that you have some sort of cooling system to keep the CPU from getting too hot. Generally, if you keep it under 80 degrees Fahrenheit, I think you should be fine. GPU, Graphics Processing Unit. It receives information from the CPU, telling it what needs to be displayed on the screen, what graphics need to be rendered onto the monitor that you're using. The reason the CPU needs to send that information to the GPU and the CPU doesn't do it itself is because graphics display rendering requires so much work and attention that if the CPU were to do it, the rest of your system would lag. CPUs used to have an integrated GPU. Nowadays, most CPUs don't even use that anymore because it doesn't make sense to have your CPU do the work of the GPU for anything when it comes to gaming or streaming. You know, if you're doing something very basic on a computer, maybe a graphics integrated processor on the CPU would be fine. But for our purposes and for most people nowadays, you want a separate GPU from your CPU. RAM, Random Access Memory. What is it for? What does it do? This guy is so important and so neglected when we talk about computers. The random access memory's job is to save things immediately and temporarily when your computer is on. While you have a hard drive or a solid state drive that's job is to save things indefinitely, the RAM's job is only to save what you're doing at the moment that you're doing it. So if I'm to turn on my computer and go onto Google, search something on YouTube, play a game, do all this sorts of stuff, if I'm was to minimize it, exit out, go back, and it's still ready to go, that's all because the RAM is doing the work for me. My computer doesn't need to remember that when I turn it off. The second I turn off my computer, the RAM no longer remembers those. Turn it back on, the RAM's job is only to remember what is happening when the computer is on. Now the question is, why is that so important? Why can't I use my solid state drive and my hard drive to save those things? Well, what happens is, guys, and you'll see if you don't have a lot of RAM in your computer, or your RAM is not put in properly, what will happen is your computer will start to drop frames significantly, or it might not even work properly, because now the solid state drive and the hard drive are trying to save everything you're doing, so we need the RAM to do that instead, because there's no need for my hard drive to fill up with my current YouTube video. You know, I don't want to save that permanently. I just want my RAM to know right now what is happening. SSD, HDD, solid state drive, and a hard drive. This is what saves stuff indefinitely to your computer. All your save files and things like that, your games, that will be loaded up into your solid state drive or your hard drive. They're essentially the same thing, except for solid state drives are faster nowadays. Hard drives are cheaper, solid state drives are faster. What does faster mean? Does not mean you're gonna get more frames in your game. It doesn't mean your game runs faster. That again is gonna be more related to the GPU, CPU, and RAM. What it means is you'll load faster. The better your SSD or your HDD, generally we're talking SSD nowadays, the faster your game loads up, the faster you can do things, because that is where it's all safe. When it comes to solid state drives, there is the external or the block, and there's what's called an M.2. M.2 goes into the motherboard itself. It is the fastest version of solid state drive, but it's way more expensive. Power supply unit, super simple to understand. That's the power that goes into your motherboard. That's the thing that gets plugged into the wall. That's what makes everything work. When it comes to power supply, you want to always have at least 100 to 150 watts over the amount you need, because you might end up overclocking. You might need more power than the computer expects. Always give yourself some leeway. Generally 80 plus gold standard is recommended. Anything above that is great. But what is 80 plus? What is gold standard? Those are certifications that a power supply unit will receive, so you know how safe it is to use. Lower tier power supply unit has a chance of overheating, burning up, ruining your computer. Case. That's the thing that houses all your pieces. All the pieces of your computer go inside of your case, so make sure it's big enough for your pieces. So many people will order a giant GPU, you know, your 3080s, they're huge, maybe a big Noctua fan. All of a sudden, your mid-tier NZXT case is not gonna fit it. You're researching your case for your computer, make sure that it fits with the pieces that you bought. OS operating system, what is it? If I were to read to you directly from Wikipedia, it would say, system software that manages computer hardware, software resources, and provides common services for computer programs. Let's make that a little easier. Operating systems create easy to use tools in order to make navigating your computer and the applications on your computer very easy. Essentially, so instead of having to program everything that you're doing, you just point and click. Windows 10 is an operating system. CPU, I recommend going with a Ryzen. If you are a streamer, I recommend Ryzen. The reason I recommend Ryzen is because they had multi-threaded cores, which means that not all their cores are dedicated to all the work. So what they've done is, as opposed to Intel, that's just like, here's your cores, everything goes on all the cores. Ryzen has made it like this many cores for gaming, this many cores for this much work. That way it's able to separate between the two and make it easy for you to both stream and game without having to worry about too much. When it comes to the motherboard, as for a streamer, I recommend that it has at least 3.0 USB ports and up. It's Ryzen compatible, since we already said we want a Ryzen CPU. It allows for overclocking, has M.2 capabilities. If you cannot use an Ethernet cable, landline cable, for some reason, make sure that it is Wi-Fi capable. Although, if you're using Wi-Fi for streaming, probably not the best idea. When it comes to CPU cooling, guys, it's up to you guys to research what you want to do best, whether it be water cooling or fans. Fans are generally cheaper. I use a fan. I use a Noctua. You can use a water cooler. We'll just understand that RGB does not do anything for your computer. It just looks cool. So if your computer's gonna be visible on stream, okay, shell out the extra money for the RGB. Otherwise, there's no need to go RGB. RGB is, by the way, that's the lighting. I know I'm saying RGB that's the lights, all those pretty lights that you see, the LEDs and all that kind of stuff running on the computers. None of that is necessary or needed. It just looks cool. Recommendations for power supply. When it comes to power supply, again, you want a gold standard and up is generally what you're looking for. Always want at least 100 to 150 watts over what your recommended wattages. There are plenty of calculators on the internet where you just type in your parts and it'll calculate what type of power you need. Corsair makes great power supply units. When you're buying a power supply, I recommend that you choose a well-known company and not a third-party company, because this is very crucial to your computer running properly. GPU, I recommend going with the best GPU that you can afford. I personally prefer NVIDIA over Ryzen. I know Ryzen has the new one, but NVIDIA has the GeForce application, which is really handy. NVIDIA understands the people that want to use their GPU, and they've made it very compatible with their filters and their streaming tools and all the sorts of things like that. I personally run a 3070. Anything in the 30 series is freaking fantastic. 2080s, remember, again, you do want a decent GPU because you're going to be both gaming and streaming, unless, of course, you're doing a dual stream, which is dual PC setup, which is something else entirely we're not going to get into today. My recommendation is, with the GPU, you go with the NVIDIA GPUs. I personally run an RTX 3070. Recommendations for RAM. When it comes to RAM, generally faster is better, but you have to make sure that it's compatible with your CPU. So look up whatever CPU you end up buying, see what speed RAM works best for it. Recommended if you're going to be streaming or gaming that you have at least 16 gigabytes of RAM, probably 3600 hertz. But again, check into it with your PC, with your CPU, see what it works best with. Generally, if you're looking for some good companies, Corsair makes good RAM, G-Kills makes good RAM. There's a lot out there. It's up to you guys. Just like I said, trying to get at least a minimum of 16 gigabytes. 3600, if you can use it, is probably what you're looking for. When it comes to SSD and HDD, there's a couple ways you want to go with it. If you're going to be using M.2 or any sort of solid state drive, Samsung Evo, excellent. I just recommend going with Samsung. They make great solid state drive. There's other options out there. I personally use the 860 Evo for my solid state drive. Hard drive, you have Barracuda. Samsung also makes hard drives. There's a bunch of options out there, but those are some of the big names. The Barracuda for hard drive and the Samsung Evo for solid state drive. I recommend with a solid state drive, you have at least 1 terabyte if you're going to be streaming. You want room for games and stuff like that. You're going to be using a lot of games. Some people like to go more. I do plan on eventually upgrading to more in the future. Right now, 1 terabyte's done fine for me. Recommended cases. There's a bunch of great cases out there. NZXT makes great cases. Corsair makes great cases. Fantex make great cases. I have a Fantex case that I absolutely love. Again, guys, comes down to preference. It's going to require some research. Up to you what you want the most. When it comes to cases, make sure 1, you have the correct pieces that will fit in the case, and 2, try to get at least 1 tempered glass side so you can see inside of it. It's actually important to be able to see your motherboard when you're turning the computer off and on. That's going to help you out with that, unless you want to turn it on while the computer is half open, and it's a lot easier. So look for a computer case that fits your pieces and has tempered glass. Some other notes on computer cases: airflow is very, very crucial. That's going to be where your fans come in. We don't have to get too much into fans. There are going to be fans that come with your case. You're probably going to want to buy 1 or 2 extra fans. Their job is to suck air in, suck cold air in, shoot hot air out. There's a lot of airflow charts out on the internet. You don't really need me to tell you too much, but the idea is computer pulls air in that's cold, passes over my CPU, which needs the cold air. A fan in the back pulls it out. Maybe a fan on the top pulls it out. And there you go, airflow. Operating system, Microsoft 10. Microsoft 10. Don't be on Mac. If do not use a Mac. For gaming and for streaming, Mac is severely limited. Severely limiting. Mac's good for editing videos, doing, some graphic work. It is not good for streaming. It is not good for gaming. Don't do it. Windows 10 is the way you're going to go. Yes, you can use Linux, but if you know how to use Linux, then you probably don't need this video. Linux is a lot more complicated. Linux is for programmers. Microsoft 10 is for the rest of us schlubs. Okay, streaming for dummies, we use Microsoft 10. Now, guys, I'm no expert on computer parts. Okay, I understand the bare minimum. That's my job, is to give you the bare minimum. I want you guys to go from it all sounding like jargon to going, oh, a CPU, I know what that does. Oh, a GPU, I know what that does. That being said, I did ask for some help with this video just to make sure that everything I said was correct. And I have 2 guys I want to be shouting out. I'm asking you guys to go check out their YouTube channels. I'm going to link them below. Check them out on Twitch. They're both extremely knowledgeable, way more knowledgeable than I am. If you have questions about computer parts, you want to get more into the hardware, check out Joker's Crowbar on Twitch, on YouTube. If you want to talk about hardware, if you want to talk about software even more, check out AyyLio on Twitch and on YouTube. These guys know their stuff. They helped me out a ton with this, just making sure that my information was correct, trying to dumb it down as much as possible to make it understandable to you guys. That being said, if you want to come hang out with me, talk more about more streaming for dummies, ideas that you want me to do for my next video, questions about my previous videos, just want to come play some games, follow me on Twitch. Already follow me here on YouTube. Like, subscribe, all the things that every YouTuber asks you. It means a lot to me. It helps me out a lot. More importantly, your comments help me out a lot, because that way I know if I'm doing something wrong or right. And I appreciate all you guys being here. Let me know how I did, and I'll see you guys next week for Twitch Journey. Take care.